Darian, I thought healing would feel like a victory. Instead, it feels like walking into every room as a stranger, including rooms I have been in 100 times, with people who have known me for years. Tim, a stranger? How does that even make sense? If you are healing, you should be getting back to yourself. You should be recognizing yourself again. Darian, that is exactly the mistake. Everyone around this person keeps waiting for the old version of them to come back, and they do not know how to tell them that she is not coming. Garrett, someone wrote those exact words to me last week, and I have not been able to stop thinking about them since. They said, I am not sure I even want her to return. Darian, something shifted after they finally left the relationship. They are calmer, more certain, much less willing to pretend. Tim, right, but if they are calmer, why do they feel like a stranger in their own life? That sounds like dissociation. That sounds like they are still traumatized, Darian. It is not dissociation, and the people who knew them before look at them like they do not quite recognize who they are talking to. Garrett, I did not expect that part to be the hardest. That is what this person told me. Not the trauma itself, but the isolation of the aftermath. Tim, so they survived the abuse only to lose their community because they changed. Darian, because they changed in a way that makes the old community deeply uncomfortable. Garrett, before we continue this conversation, if this kind of content resonates with you, subscribing makes sure the algorithm sends you more, because this conversation is going to get much more intense in a few minutes. Darian, we need to talk about the return, because everyone talks about the escape. Everyone talks about the abuse, the narcissist, the exit strategy. But almost nobody talks about what happens when the empath comes back. Tim, probably because everyone assumes the return is the easy part. You survived. The monster is gone. Now you just rebuild. Darian, rebuild what exactly? Tim, the life you had before, the person you were before. Garrett, I spent 12 years working in hospice care. I sat with families as they watched someone they loved disappear into illness. But I also saw something else. I saw patients who survived devastating losses. People who went right to the edge of the abyss, looked down into it, and somehow pulled back. And when they returned to their families, the family sometimes described losing the person twice. Tim, losing them twice? But they survived. The family should be celebrating. They got their loved one back. Darian, you would think so, but survival changes the architecture of the psyche. You do not just walk away from the abyss unchanged, Tim, but you are talking about near-death experiences, medical crises. We are talking about surviving a narcissistic relationship. Those are not the same thing. Darian, are they not? When a sense of self has been completely obliterated over more than a decade, the psyche registers that as an existential death. It is an annihilation of the ego. Listen to what survivors actually say. One woman, Catherine Chestnut, wrote about her recovery. She said, "My sense of self had been completely obliterated. I honestly thought I was losing my mind." Garrett, another survivor, Madison Morgan, described the exact same phenomenon. She said, "I did not know myself anymore. I could not seem to access the internal sense of direction everyone else seemed to have." And another woman named Diane described how fundamental activities that defined her identity simply vanished after leaving. She said, "I did not read a book for like 6 months, and for me, that was crazy." Tim, exactly. That is trauma. That is what I'm saying. The relationship broke their compass. The narcissist took away their sense of self. Now they just need time to find it again, to heal, to get back to normal. Darian, they are not going back to normal, and that is the fundamental misunderstanding that makes the return so agonizing. Tim, what do you mean they are not going back? Of course they are. Healing means returning to baseline. It means recovering what was lost. Darian, no. Healing from this specific kind of psychological destruction means something entirely different. It means becoming something else entirely. And Carl Jung predicted exactly what this looks like, Tim. Okay, show me. Where did Jung say that trauma means you cannot go back to being yourself? Garrett, when I left hospice care, I was completely burned out. I had spent over a decade absorbing other people's pain. I was carrying it around, thinking that was what it meant to be strong. I thought being an empath meant being a sponge for the suffering of the world. My own life was falling apart. My marriage ended when I was 39. I completely lost my identity. Tim: That sounds incredibly difficult, but what does it have to do with the empath coming back from narcissistic abuse? Garrett: During that crisis, a therapist handed me a copy of Memories, Dreams, Reflections by Carl Jung. I spent nights awake in my empty apartment just reading it obsessively, and it cracked something open. Because Jung gave a name to what I was experiencing, he gave a framework for the absolute destruction of the previous self. Darian: In 1952, Jung published the 5th volume of his collected works. It is a monumental text called Symbols of Transformation, and in it, he establishes the foundational archetype of descent and return. He calls it the nekyia. Tim: The nekyia, like a myth from antiquity? Darian: Not just a myth, a psychological reality, the night sea journey, the descent into the underworld of the unconscious. Jung wrote that the treasure which the hero fetches from the dark cavern is life. It is himself, newborn from the dark maternal cave of the unconscious. Tim: That is very poetic, but it is just a metaphor for getting better after a hard time. Darian: It is not a metaphor for getting better. It is a structural, clinical description of transformation. Listen carefully to the rest of what Jung wrote. He said that the hero who enters the monster's belly and kindles a fire within it is not the same one who emerges. Garrett cleansed in the healing waters. The sun lives again, but it rises on a different shore. The night sea journey ends not where it began. The person who comes back is not the person who went in. Tim: Okay, I hear the poetry. I hear the archetype. But let us be practical here. You have not actually changed on a fundamental level. You have just finally stopped performing a version of yourself for the narcissist. What looks like a massive transformation is just you, finally living without the mask. Darian: You think this is just taking off a mask? Tim: Yes, I think it is exactly that. The narcissistic abuse made them hide who they really were. It forced them to shrink. Now they are safe, so they are just being themselves again. The people around them just need to get used to the real them. The mask is gone. Darian: That would make logical sense, except the clinical data completely contradicts you. Tim: What data? Are you talking about Jung again? Darian: No, I am talking about modern empirical research on post-traumatic growth, hard data. Garrett: In the year 2004, 2 researchers named Tedeschi and Calhoun published a foundational paper in the journal Psychological Inquiry. They were studying what happens to people after severe life-altering trauma. Darian: They developed a psychometric instrument called the Post-Traumatic Growth Inventory. It is a 21-item assessment tool, and they found that post-traumatic growth is documented across 5 validated domains: new possibilities, relating to others, personal strength, spiritual change, and appreciation of life. Tim: Okay, so people grow after trauma. That is not groundbreaking. Everyone knows that what does not kill you makes you stronger. Darian: You're not listening to the data. Tedeschi and Calhoun specifically distinguished return to self from genuine psychological growth. Survivors scoring high on this inventory are not reporting being themselves again. They are reporting new capacities that were genuinely absent before the trauma. Garrett: They are not going back to a baseline. They are not returning to an original state. They are developing an entirely new psychological architecture, capacities they never possessed before. Darian survivors of narcissistic abuse most robustly report gains in personal strength and change relating to others. They become fundamentally less available to manipulation. They become highly selective in who gets access to them. Tim: But that could just be hypervigilance. They are scared. They have been hurt. So they put up massive walls to protect themselves. Darian: The clinical instruments cannot be fooled by a narrative. This is documented structural change. It is not hypervigilance. It is the empirical fingerprint of what people around them experience as unrecognizable. Garrett: This is why they feel like strangers in rooms they have been in 100 times. Because the person who used to walk into those rooms had a specific set of vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities that made the narcissistic relationship possible in the first place. Tim: Wait a second. Are you saying it was their fault they were abused, that they asked for it, Darian? Absolutely not. Abuse is always 100% the fault of the abuser. But the architecture of the empath, the boundless willingness to absorb another person's pain, the massive suppression of their own needs, that is a vulnerability. And that vulnerability has been eradicated in the fire of the nekyia. Garrett. That is what my former colleagues told me after I left hospice care. They had known me for years. We had worked side by side through unimaginable tragedies. But months later, when we reconnected, they told me I seemed quieter. Harder to read. They said I had a different kind of presence than before. A heavier presence. Tim? Did that bother you? That people who knew you for years thought you were harder to read? That sounds incredibly alienating. Garrett. It confused me at first. I felt like I was failing at being myself. But then the therapist who gave me Jung's book remarked on it too. She looked at me during a session and said, "You look older, but lighter. Like you stopped carrying something that was not yours." And Darian, you stopped carrying what was not yours, and that makes you completely illegible to people who only knew you as a carrier. Tim, I understand the argument you are making. I really do. But I am still not convinced this applies to everyone. Most trauma survivors return to who they were. This unrecognizable feeling has to be temporary. Give it 2 years, maybe 3, and you will be back to your baseline. Time heals all wounds. Darian. You are citing Bonanno's research without even realizing it, Tim. Who is Bonanno? Darian. George Bonanno. Also in the year 2004, he published a massive longitudinal study in the American Psychologist Journal. It is a landmark paper. He studied loss, trauma, and human resilience. Garrett Bonanno's research is incredibly important because it provides the correct base rate for resilience. It shows that 50 to 60% of trauma survivors demonstrate resilience, which means they return to baseline functioning without significant lasting symptoms. They bounce back. Tim, exactly 50 to 60%, the majority. So the majority of people do go back to normal. They do return to their baseline, the mask comes off, and they go back to their lives, Darian. Yes, the majority do. But what about the other 40 to 50%? Tim, they stay traumatized, they develop chronic PTSD. Darian, some of them do develop chronic pathology, but Bonanno's resilience research is accurate about the 50 to 60%. The remaining 40 to 50% do not return to baseline, and Jung's nekyia explicitly describes the transformative minority within that group. Garrett Jung was writing about the people for whom the descent was so deep, so absolute that no return to the previous shore is possible. The old shore is gone. Darian. The question is not whether transformation is the majority outcome. The question is which trajectory describes the person who is standing here right now, watching this video, asking this question. The viewer who feels unrecognizable after coming back from narcissistic abuse is not in the 50 to 60% majority who bounce back. They are in the transformative minority. Tim, I still think this change feeling is just trauma talking. It is post-traumatic stress disorder. It is emotional numbing. It is hyper-arousal misread as spiritual transformation. You are dressing up pathology as enlightenment. Darian, let us look at another piece of evidence. When you look at the psychological profiles of those who survive extended narcissistic abuse, you see a specific pattern of adaptation. The empath does not just lose their identity, they actively suppress it to avoid conflict. Every preference, every opinion, every desire is filtered through the lens of how the abuser will react. Tim, right, they become a chameleon. They blend in to survive. Garrett, but blending in requires a tremendous amount of psychic energy. It takes a massive toll on the central nervous system. You are constantly running a background program of threat assessment. Indra, Darian, and when the relationship finally ends, when the empath escapes, that background program does not just shut off immediately, but when it finally does, the energy that was tied up in survival is liberated. Tim, liberated energy. That sounds like a good thing. Darian, it is a profoundly good thing. But liberated energy is chaotic. It demands expression. This is why the return feels so strange. The empath is suddenly flooded with their own desires, their own opinions, their own anger. It feels alien because they have not felt it in years. Garrett, I remember sitting in my apartment staring at the walls, realizing I did not even know what kind of food I actually liked. I had spent so long eating whatever my partner wanted, watching whatever she wanted to watch, that my own preferences had completely atrophied. Tim, that is devastating. To lose the basic building blocks of who you are. Darian, it is devastating. But the rebuilding process is where the true transformation occurs. Because you are not just remembering who you were. You are actively deciding who you will become. And that process is fundamentally different from a return to baseline. Darian PTSD symptoms are real. They should be treated with utmost seriousness. But Roberts and colleagues confirmed in a 2007 paper in the Psychological Bulletin that the Big Five personality traits remain largely stable post-trauma, meaning the dysregulation is typically a temporary overlay on a stable structure. Garrett. But the growth Tedeschi and Calhoun measured happens after symptom stabilization. It describes something beyond the symptom layer. It describes structural evolution. Darian. Which brings us to the core mechanism. The reason the empath feels unrecognizable is not a symptom, it is a psychological law. Tim. A psychological law like what? Like physics? Darian, like gravity, but for the psyche. Jung adapted a principle from the ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus. He called it enantiodromia. Mrish, Tim, enantiodromia. What does that even mean? Garrett. It is detailed in the 6th volume of the Collected Works. Psychological Types, published in 1921. Jung used it to describe what happens when a one-sided psychological attitude is pushed to an absolute extreme. Darian. When you push the psyche too far in one direction, the suppressed opposite erupts from the unconscious and seizes the personality. It is an inevitable pendulum swing. Tim. The suppressed opposite erupts? Darian. Yes, think about the empath in a narcissistic relationship. What is their psychological attitude? What is their daily reality? Garrett. They spend years, sometimes decades, absorbing the emotional states of the narcissist. They constantly monitor the environment. They suppress their own anger. They suppress their own needs. They completely erase their own limits to keep the peace. They become a mirror for someone else's ego. Darian. Exactly. A decade-long, one-sided extreme. They become nothing but accommodation, nothing but empathy, nothing but surrender. Tim. So, enantiodromia means the exact opposite comes out? Darian. Enantiodromia is the psychological mechanism driving the unrecognizable return. What was suppressed for years now has the floor. It demands to be heard. Garrett. The anger that was never expressed, the boundaries that were never enforced, the needs that were always ignored, the intolerance for manipulation. They erupt, and they seize the personality. Tim. But that sounds incredibly dangerous. If they swing completely to the opposite, they just become as toxic as the narcissist. They become the abuser. Darian. No, that is a fundamental misunderstanding of the mechanism. The psyche is not broken. It is not becoming toxic. It is restoring balance. It is correcting a massive, life-threatening imbalance. As Garrett. The enantiodromia is not a dysfunction. It is a rescue mission launched by the unconscious. It is the psyche fighting for its own survival. Tim, a rescue mission? Garrett, yes, because the old self was going to die. The old self was going to be completely consumed by the narcissist. If the opposite did not erupt, the empath would have ceased to exist. Darian. The person who emerges from this massive correction has integrated their shadow. They have integrated their capacity to say no, their capacity to be disagreeable, their capacity to walk away without guilt. Tim. And that is why everyone else is so uncomfortable, because the empath is finally saying no. Darian. Precisely. The people who benefited from the empath's lack of boundaries are suddenly faced with a fortress, and they call the fortress strange. They call it a trauma response. Garrett. A clinical social worker named Annie Wright specializes in this exact phenomenon. She has built a clinical framework around it. She calls it identity excavation. Darian Wright points out that the central question of post-narcissism recovery is, who am I when I am not organized around his needs? Tim. Who am I when I am not organized around someone else? Garrett. It is a terrifying question. Because for years, the empath's entire identity, their entire daily routine, was structured around managing the narcissist's moods, anticipating their demands, soothing their rages, walking on eggshells. Darian Wright identifies identity excavation as the painstaking process of digging through the rubble of the relationship to find the parts of the self that got buried under years of abuse. Tim. So they do go back to finding their old parts? They do go back to who they were? Darian. No. Listen to the critical clinical observation Wright makes. Recovery is not a return to who you were before the relationship. Garrett, why? Because the pre-relationship self had structural vulnerabilities that made the relationship possible in the first place. Tim, Darian. Yes. The self that emerges from genuine recovery is more boundaried, less prone to fusion. Capable of a kind of absolute presence the pre-abuse self simply was not capable of. Tim, I do not have a good answer for that. Garrett, it is uncomfortable, isn't it? Tim, it is deeply uncomfortable, because I came into this conversation thinking that healing meant returning to innocence, returning to the beautiful person you were before the bad thing happened. But you are saying that person is gone, and they have to be gone. Darian, they have to be gone, because that person was prey. Tim, that person was prey, and the new person is not. Garrett, remember what you said at the very beginning of this conversation? That if you are healing, you should be getting back to yourself. You should be recognizing yourself again. Darian, that is exactly what everyone expects. That is the pervasive narrative of healing. And that expectation is a trap. It is the demand that you remain the version of yourself that was easy to control, easy to consume. Tim, I did not expect this. I really thought they just needed time to get back to normal, to find their old compass. Garrett, we all want to go back to normal. We all want the comfort of the familiar. But normal was the environment where the abuse thrived. Normal was the soil where the narcissists planted their flags. You cannot go back there. Tim, I came into this conversation with one absolute certainty. I leave with another. And the second one is infinitely better. The unrecognizable face in the mirror is not a stranger you should fear. It is the self you earned in the fire. Garrett, and that is the absolute truth of it, Darian. The night sea journey ends not where it began. You rise on a different shore, and you are finally equipped to live there, with new capacities, new strength, and absolute clarity. Garrett, the strangeness that other people perceive in you after you return is not a sign that you are broken. It is the ultimate confirmation that the transformation was real. Garrett, if this conversation gave you clarity today, I want to ask you to consider using the super thanks button below the video. The truth is, discussions like this, diving deep into Jungian theory, exploring enantiodromia, and examining clinical data on narcissistic abuse, they are extremely rare because the algorithm favors quick fixes and easy answers. We do not do that here. Your support allows me to keep researching, keep digging, and keep bringing these deeper truths to light. You're not just a passive viewer. You are part of a community that values the profound over the superficial. Garrett, so I want to know where you stand now. Who did you agree with at the start of this video, and did the concept of enantiodromia make you change your perspective? Tell me in the comments. The conversation continues down there.